Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let go of the day. Allow yourself to relax and settle into a peaceful state as my voice gently guides you through a world of calm and tranquility. With each word, feel the tension slip away, leaving only relaxation and comfort. Let's drift into a soothing story together as you begin your journey into a restful and rejuvenating sleep. Imagine a young boy, barely 16 years old, thrust into the weighty and perilous world of imperial rule. His name, Caligula, once spoken with affection, now destined to echo through history as a name drenched in infamy. In the beginning, he was a golden prince beloved by the Roman legions who marched alongside his father, Germanicus, through the harsh terrains of the empire. Clad in miniature armor, he was the embodiment of Rome's future, or so they believed. To them, he was the son of the legendary general, the heir to a powerful dynasty that stretched from the wilds of Britain to the sun-soaked shores of Egypt. But power, as we know, is a fragile thing. Even for a child born into such promise, the shadows of fate are long and unforgiving. Caligula's early life was filled with moments of brilliance and joy, an adoration for his father, the affection of Roman soldiers, the embrace of a loving family. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, fiercely protective and deeply noble, nurtured him amidst the courtly intrigues that swirled around Rome. But even as Caligula was lifted by the love of his people, his destiny was being shaped in the shadows, where the winds of betrayal and tragedy were already stirring. The young boy's world was shattered in the year 19 CE. His father, Germanicus, struck down mysteriously in the prime of his life, left Caligula and his siblings in the care of a Roman Empire torn by power struggles and deceit. Whispers circulated. Some believed that Emperor Tiberius, Caligula's own great uncle, was behind the death, but it was a truth never fully confirmed. Still, the tragic loss left a gaping wound in young Caligula's heart, one that would shape his views of power forever. And just as the world seemed to fall apart, the power struggles began to deepen. Agrippina, his mother, sought vengeance for her husband's death, standing fiercely against Tiberius. But the imperial court was not kind to those who challenged the emperor. One by one, Caligula's siblings were exiled or executed, leaving him as the last survivor. Yet, in the midst of such death and ruin, Caligula remained, like a tree alone in a storm, seemingly untouched by the chaos that had consumed his family. Sent to live under the watchful eye of Tiberius, Caligula became a silent observer of the dark politics of Rome. He lived on the island of Capri, a place that had long been the retreat of Tiberius, where the old emperor's reclusive nature and increasingly bizarre behavior created a court defined by paranoia and indulgence. Here, Caligula would witness the full extent of Tiberius's power, his secretive whispers, his cruelty masked in politeness, and his endless schemes to consolidate his control. Despite being forced into this grim reality, Caligula learned. He learned the art of survival in a world where loyalty was fickle, and the difference between life and death could hinge on a single whispered word. For years, Caligula played the part, charming the court, biding his time, and waiting for his moment to strike. It wasn't until the year 37 CE that Tiberius's reign came to an abrupt and unexpected end. The emperor, growing old and frail, passed away, and Caligula, now a young man, was proclaimed the new ruler of Rome. The people, weary of Tiberius's cold and distant rule, welcomed Caligula with open arms. They saw in him the promise of a new era, one of hope, compassion, and a return to the glory of Rome. But what the people did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that the boy who had once charmed the legions would soon descend into madness. The seeds of power had been planted early in Caligula's life, but they would soon sprout into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The early days of Caligula's reign were nothing short of spectacular. The streets of Rome, long suffocated by the chill of Tiberius's rule, suddenly burst with life again. The people rejoiced, throwing themselves into the celebration of their new emperor, a youthful ruler they believed would restore the empire's former glory. For a time, it seemed that their hopes had not been in vain. Rome became a city of celebration. Spectacles were held in the grand arenas. Magnificent feasts and games filled the calendar, bringing joy to the common people. The emperor, once a mere prince, now stood before them as their shining star. He released political prisoners, pardoning the wronged and cleansing the state of the bitter aftertaste of Tiberius's oppressive trials. In those first months, Caligula's every gesture seemed to prove him a man of compassion, a ruler who could heal the wounds left by his predecessor. But in the midst of this euphoria, something else began to stir. The seeds of madness, which had silently taken root during his years on the island of Capri, began to sprout, feeding on his newfound power. It was said that after Caligula fell ill during the first year of his reign, something within him changed. Perhaps it was the fever, or maybe it was something darker that had begun to twist inside him. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, though no one could say for sure. What was undeniable, however, was the transformation that followed. The charming young emperor who had promised a golden age vanished, replaced by something far more sinister, a tyrant whose cruelty would come to define his rule. At first, it was subtle. Caligula's decisions, though erratic, could still be justified by those who wanted to see the best in him. He drained the empire's treasury, yes, but only for magnificent palaces, grandiose spectacles, and gifts meant to keep the people happy. Still, there was an underlying feeling that something was off, something that no one could quite put their finger on. Slowly, over time, his actions began to speak louder than his words, and his intentions became darker. As the months went on, the people who had once adored him began to see another side of their emperor. He surrounded himself with sycophants, filling his court with those who would sing his praises, who would indulge his every whim. He demanded that statues of himself be erected in temples, that people bow before him as if he were a god. His vanity knew no bounds, but it was more than just self-love. It was a dangerous delusion, a belief that he was above all, above the gods, above the law, above the very foundation of Rome itself. Caligula's cruelty also began to take on more grotesque forms. Senators who had once been his allies were forced to grovel before him. Public humiliations, once rare, became a spectacle. To watch a senator, a person of great dignity and power, bow before the emperor was now a commonplace event. Caligula reveled in their degradation. But it wasn't just political figures who felt his wrath. Even his closest companions were not safe from his whims. Friends, allies, and even family members were not spared from his violent outbursts. Anyone who displeased him, no matter how loyal or beloved, could fall victim to his cruelty. Death, it seemed, was no longer something to be feared. It was merely another tool in his quest for control. His cruelty extended to the realm of the absurd. Caligula's obsession with power became a farce in itself. He famously announced that he would wage war on Neptune, the god of the sea. His soldiers, without question, were ordered to march to the shores of the English Channel, where they were commanded to collect seashells as spoils of war. The sight of the Roman legions, so famed for their military prowess, collecting shells from the shore, sent a shockwave of disbelief through the empire. What had happened to the great emperor who had promised glory and wisdom? And yet, even as Rome watched in stunned silence, Caligula's madness continued. He began to see himself as a god, as the physical manifestation of Jupiter, the king of the gods. He demanded that his image be placed in every temple, that priests and citizens alike bow before him as if he were divine. What had begun as a ruler seeking to please his people had descended into an emperor whose needs were no longer for the people, but for his own insatiable ego. The more Caligula indulged in his growing power, the further he slipped into an abyss from which there would be no return. His reign, once filled with public celebrations and promises of a new golden age, had now descended into a chaotic and terrifying spectacle. What began as extravagance and opulence became a grotesque theatre, where Caligula's every whim, no matter how cruel or absurd, was treated as law. He no longer ruled to serve Rome, but to remind Rome of his supremacy. The streets of Rome, once a place of jubilant gatherings, now echoed with whispers of fear. Where once Caligula had been hailed as the son of Germanicus, now he was seen as something far more dangerous, a tyrant who could end a life with a snap of his fingers, who reveled in the agony of those who fell from his favor. His obsession with power had begun to twist his sense of reality, and with it, his sense of morality. The grand spectacles that once served to delight the masses now became blood-soaked events, a showcase of his unchecked cruelty. The Senate, that ancient institution that once stood as the bedrock of Roman power, was now nothing more than a mere puppet show. Senators were summoned to Caligula's court to endure the humiliation of bowing before him, begging for favors that might never come. Those who dared defy him were swiftly punished, often in the most horrific ways. Executions became routine, not for any political necessity, but because Caligula found it amusing. The list of those who displeased him, or even those who merely looked at him the wrong way, grew longer with each passing day. But it wasn't just the senators who felt the weight of his cruelty. His family too was not exempt from his reign of terror. Once the imperial family had been a source of pride for Rome. Now it was a collection of broken lives. His sisters, once revered women of Rome, found themselves caught in the emperor's web of madness. It was rumored that Caligula had an unnatural affection for his sister Drusilla, whom he had declared a goddess after her death. It was a macabre tribute, one that sent shudders through the empire. His family, like all others, became pawns in his power game, forced to submit to his will or face execution. His cruelty extended to those closest to him, even his friends. No one was safe. Caligula's paranoia had blossomed into a full-blown obsession. He believed that everyone, from the lowliest citizen to the most powerful general, was conspiring against him. Every friendly gesture, every act of loyalty was suspect. In his eyes, loyalty was no longer a virtue but a tool to be exploited. Those who refused to fall in line, or worse, those who were too vocal in their support of others, were swiftly punished. One of his most infamous acts of cruelty involved the execution of those who merely displeased him. It was said that Caligula would order people to be tortured for his own amusement, dragging them through the streets of Rome to show the public that no one was beyond his reach. And yet, it was not just physical pain that he inflicted upon those who dared defy him. He destroyed the very essence of their dignity, stripping them of their humanity, turning them into mere objects for his twisted pleasure. This madness, however, was not confined to mere violence. It spread into Caligula's every decision. His rule became a festival of excess and paranoia. He drained the imperial treasury, using the wealth of Rome to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Palaces were built at breakneck speed, monuments were erected in his name, and the Roman legions were forced to spend months away from home, engaged in futile campaigns and mock wars. Caligula's obsession with his own divinity knew no bounds. He proclaimed himself to be the living incarnation of Jupiter, the king of the gods. Statues of him were placed in every temple, and he demanded that priests and citizens alike bow before his likeness. He had become a god in his own mind. Perhaps the most absurd and terrifying of his acts was his declaration of war against Neptune, the god of the sea. In an act that defied all logic, Caligula ordered his soldiers to march to the shores of the English Channel, where they were commanded to collect seashells as spoils of war. The Roman legions, once feared for their discipline and military genius, were reduced to nothing more than collectors of shells. The absurdity of the act stunned the empire, and yet it was just another manifestation of the emperor's complete disregard for reason, tradition, or human dignity. Even as his empire faltered under the weight of his madness, Caligula continued to push forward, believing himself to be untouchable, immortal. The cries of the people, the warnings from his advisors, all fell on deaf ears. He had become so consumed by his own power that he could no longer see the world as it was. Instead, he saw only a stage upon which he could act out his darkest fantasies. The inevitable had arrived. What was once a story of rise and glory now turned to whispers of conspiracy, betrayal, and death. Caligula's reign, built upon a foundation of paranoia, cruelty, and delusions of divinity, had spiraled into the very madness he had once sought to control. Even the mighty emperor, who once believed himself untouchable, could not escape the crushing weight of his own tyranny. The walls of the palace, once resplendent with splendor and noise, were now thick with silence. The grandeur of the Roman Empire had been reduced to the lonely clink of chains and the rustle of conspiratorial whispers. There was no longer any room for doubt. The end was near. Caligula had made countless enemies in his short reign. Senators, soldiers, even his closest friends, all had fallen prey to his unpredictable wrath. Those who once swore loyalty to him now whispered behind closed doors, plotting his downfall. The seeds of rebellion were sown, not just in the Senate, but in the very heart of the empire's military. It was the men who swore to protect him, the very soldiers who once looked to him as their divine ruler, who began to see the emperor for what he had become, a madman who ruled not with wisdom, but with terror. The Praetorian Guard, Caligula's personal protectors, those who swore an oath to defend his life, had finally had enough. The conspiracy began to take shape. It was not a singular act of defiance, but a slow and steady accumulation of resentment, an undercurrent of dissent that finally reached a boiling point. The Praetorian Guard, once his loyal shield, now became his silent executioners. They too had grown weary of his cruelty, of the executions carried out on a whim, of the bizarre and absurd orders that had drained the empire's resources. They had seen the glory of Rome tarnished, her dignity broken under the heel of a madman, and they could bear it no longer. The plot to assassinate Caligula was not a sudden act, but a culmination of months, perhaps even years, of simmering discontent. A group of conspirators, led by a trusted officer named Cassius Chaerea, waited for the right moment. They knew that the time had come when no further bloodshed could be tolerated, when no more lives could be sacrificed in the name of one man's delusions. The emperor, in his arrogance, was blind to the growing threat around him. He believed he was invincible, that no one could harm him, that his reign would last forever. It was January 24th, 41st CE, a day that would echo through history as the end of Caligula's empire. The emperor, oblivious to the impending danger, strode confidently through the palace corridors, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of further consolidating his power. He had no idea that the very men sworn to protect him had turned against him, that his downfall had been planned by those he trusted most. As he walked through the narrow halls of his palace, the conspirators struck. In a flurry of movement, they surrounded him. Swords flashed, and within moments, Caligula, the emperor who had once believed himself to be divine, was struck down. 30 times the blade pierced his flesh. 30 times the ruler of Rome was brought to his knees. His blood stained the marble floors of the palace, a cruel reminder of the power he had wielded, and the darkness that had consumed him. In his final moments, as he lay dying on the cold floor, Caligula, once the Golden Prince, once the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, did not plead for mercy. His once terrifying voice, which had commanded legions, was now silenced by the weight of his own misdeeds. His reign had ended not in battle, but in betrayal. It was a tragic irony for a man who had seen the world as his stage, who had reveled in his own grandeur, only to be cut down by those who had once been loyal to him. But even in death, the madness of Caligula lingered. His wife and young daughter too were executed, ensuring that no heir could rise to claim his throne. His name, once spoken with adoration, would now be whispered only in fear, a warning of what happens when power is entrusted to the unhinged. The empire, stunned by the suddenness of his assassination, struggled to comprehend the fall of their emperor. Was Caligula truly mad, or had he merely played a role, testing the limits of what a ruler could do? Some believed he had been suffering from a neurological disorder, while others speculated about the impact of his early illnesses. Regardless of the cause, one thing was clear. His reign had left a lasting scar on Rome, a city that had once revered him now scarred by his tyranny. The death of Caligula sent shockwaves through Rome, but it was not the end of the story. As his lifeless body was left in the dirt, the Roman Empire was forced to reckon with the aftermath of his rule. The people, relieved at the end of a tyrant's reign, could hardly comprehend the scale of the damage that had been done. For those who had suffered under his cruel gaze, the horrors of his rule were still fresh, like wounds that had only just begun to heal. But Rome, in all its might, was a place where power shifted swiftly, and the crown passed from one ruler to the next. In the days following Caligula's assassination, the empire scrambled to fill the power vacuum. The Senate, though shaken, regained some semblance of authority, but it was clear that the fate of Rome could not rest in their hands alone. The Praetorian Guard, the very men who had conspired to end Caligula's life, now found themselves in control of the empire's destiny. It was one of their own, Caligula's uncle Claudius, who was thrust onto the imperial throne. His ascension was not met with the same exuberant celebrations that had greeted his nephew's rise. Instead, there was a somber acknowledgement of the empire's fragile state, a recognition that the cost of power had been too high. But while Caligula's death marked the end of his reign, it did not erase his legacy. His name would live on, not as the hero his family had once hoped for, but as a symbol of what can happen when absolute power falls into the wrong hands. The Roman people who had once adored him would now whisper his name in fear. He became a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of how unchecked ambition can turn a ruler into a monster. Even in death, Caligula's influence persisted. His reign had irrevocably altered the course of Roman history, laying the groundwork for the instability that would follow. The empire, though vast and powerful, had been left fragile in the wake of his madness. The cracks in the foundation, caused by his erratic rule, would only widen in the years to come. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political life, would never fully regain the power it once held. The people, too, would never forget the terror they had endured under Caligula's reign. His name would be used as shorthand for tyranny, his deeds etched into the annals of history as the very embodiment of evil. Historians would debate for centuries whether Caligula was truly mad, or whether he had simply used his insanity as a mask for a deeper, more calculated desire for power. Some believed that he had been suffering from a mental illness, a neurological disorder that had shaped his behavior. Others argued that he had been playing a role, testing the limits of what a ruler could get away with. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same. An empire, once glorious, had been brought to its knees by the whims of one man. In the years following his death, the empire moved on, as it always did. Claudius, though often seen as weak and unworthy of the throne, managed to restore some stability to Rome. But the shadow of Caligula's reign never fully faded. The memory of his cruelty haunted the halls of the imperial palace, and the stories of his madness were told and retold, becoming a part of Roman folklore. The emperor who had once believed himself a god was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a whisper in the dark, warning of what can happen when absolute power is given to those who cannot control it. And yet, even in death, Caligula's reign had one final, twisted gift for history. It was under his rule that the lex majestatis, the law against treason, became a tool for silencing dissent and consolidating imperial power. His example would be used by future emperors as a justification for their own excesses. His madness, though tragic, had provided a blueprint for how not to rule, and it would echo throughout the empire for generations. The legacy of Caligula, though grim, was not without its lessons. As you lay your head to rest tonight, think of him not just as a tyrant, but as a reminder that power, when wielded without wisdom, can corrupt and destroy not only those who hold it, but the very empire that gives it to them. His name will forever be associated with excess, cruelty, and madness, but also with the fragility of power. For even the mightiest rulers, when consumed by their own hubris, can fall, and when they do, the world remembers. So, sleep well, dear dreamer, and know that while Caligula's reign was short and filled with bloodshed, it left behind a legacy that still lingers in the shadows of history. His name will always echo as a warning of the danger of unchecked power and the inevitable downfall of those who believe themselves invincible. As the years passed, the name of Caligula faded from the immediate consciousness of the Roman people, but the echo of his reign reverberated through the corridors of history. The empire, ever resilient, moved forward, rebuilding itself from the ruins of his madness. Claudius, though not the ideal ruler in the eyes of many, had stabilized the empire, and his reign brought a semblance of peace. But even in the years of relative tranquility that followed, the shadow of Caligula remained a lingering presence in the minds of the Roman citizens. His madness, once a spectacle for the masses, now existed as a silent whisper in the back of the empire's collective memory. It would take more than the passage of time to erase the stains of his rule. Historians and philosophers, always watching from the distance of the past, began to weigh the meaning of Caligula's reign. In the annals of Rome, his story was written not in the glowing ink of glory, but in the dark, cold letters of warning. He became a figure both fascinating and terrifying, a symbol of the dangers of absolute power unchecked by reason. Some considered him a madman, a ruler driven by illness, perhaps a neurological disorder that twisted his mind. Others saw him as a calculated ruler who tested the very limits of his power, pushing the boundaries of what one man could command. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same. He had been consumed by his own mind, and with him the empire had nearly crumbled. For future emperors, Caligula's story would become a cautionary tale. It would be told in whispers, a lesson in what happens when ambition becomes a destructive force. In the quiet chambers of the Senate, his name would be invoked as a reminder of the fragility of the throne. His actions, those of vanity, cruelty, and madness, would become the yardstick by which every future ruler would measure themselves, for better or worse. As the empire moved into a new era, the echoes of Caligula's reign reverberated through the halls of Rome, influencing the decisions of emperors who followed. Even the great emperors who seemed to embody the ideals of Rome, such as Trajan and Hadrian, were keenly aware of the dangers of excess, of the potential madness that could lurk beneath the surface of power. For them, Caligula became the embodiment of everything Rome should avoid: the all-consuming hunger for control, the disregard for human life, the terrifying belief in one's divinity. Yet, the true legacy of Caligula's reign was not confined to Rome. The story of his madness, his rise, and his fall traveled beyond the borders of the empire, whispered into the ears of kings, queens, and rulers of distant lands. His name would be passed down through the generations, not as a hero, but as a warning, a symbol of the danger that lurks when power is handed to a man who believes himself to be above all others. His story, once filled with glory, became one of devastation. It was no longer a tale of a promising prince, but of a tyrant whose madness brought a mighty empire to its knees. And so, as you drift into sleep tonight, let the story of Caligula serve as a reminder that those who wield power without wisdom, who rule without compassion, may find themselves alone, forgotten by history. For even the most powerful rulers can become shadows, their names swallowed by time, their deeds fading into the darkness of the past. Yet their echoes remain, reverberating through the pages of history, warning those who would follow in their footsteps. As you close your eyes and let the quiet of the night surround you, know that even the most feared tyrants, those who believed they were invincible, can be undone by their own arrogance. Caligula's reign was a brief and tragic chapter in the history of Rome, but his legacy endures, not in the monuments he built, but in the lesson he left behind. In the centuries that followed, Caligula's name continued to be woven into the fabric of history, but not as one would imagine for a ruler of an empire as vast as Rome. His story was told not with admiration, but with caution. Rome, despite its endless cycles of emperors, would never forget the scars left by the man who had once believed himself to be divine. Yet as time marched on, the grandeur of his reign faded into shadow, and the empire he had ruled continued to evolve, leaving behind the memory of a mad emperor as little more than a warning. But in the quiet chambers of scholars and philosophers, his story persisted. Historians, with their meticulous eyes, did not let the story of Caligula fade into the night. They pondered, questioned, and debated whether the madness of Caligula was the product of an undiagnosed illness or the result of the overwhelming power he had wielded, unchecked and unchallenged. Some believed it was the fever he had suffered that transformed him. Others whispered that it was the weight of an empire too great for any mortal to bear. Whatever the cause, one fact remained. Caligula had plunged into a darkness that no one, not even his closest allies, could have predicted. As time passed, the empire shifted, and the rulers who followed him, some wise, some just as hungry for power, shaped the Roman world in their own ways. Some learned from the terror Caligula had left behind. Others simply used his name as a backdrop to their own fears. The gods had never been kind to those who sought absolute power, and the emperor's fall was a grim reminder of the folly in believing that one person could control an empire meant for many. And yet, for all the lessons his rule left behind, Caligula's legacy was more than just a warning. It was a lingering shadow that loomed over the future of Roman leadership. Even as emperors like Claudius, Nero, and Vespasian reigned, with their own glories and failures, the name of Caligula was never far from reach. His reign became the blueprint for what not to do. Rulers across generations looked at him as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of the corruption that absolute power could bring. His name was invoked in speeches, in the halls of the Senate, and in whispered conversations between those who sought to claim the throne. The memory of Caligula's excesses, the grand palaces, the insane proclamations of divinity, the cruel executions, haunted those who dared to follow in his footsteps. His madness had been a disease, a sickness that spread from the heart of the empire to its very soul. It was in the hearts of the people, too, that Caligula's legacy endured. The common citizens of Rome who had once cheered for him, who had thrown lavish celebrations in his honor, now remembered the dark emperor with a mixture of fear and regret. They remembered the emptiness left in the wake of his cruelty, the terror that had seeped into every corner of their lives. Their lives had been touched by his madness, for they were the ones who had watched in silent horror as their emperor's reign spiraled out of control. The festivals that once filled the streets with joy now became hollow, remembered only as a time before the empire had truly realized the cost of one man's obsession. In the end, though, it was not just the people or the scholars who carried Caligula's legacy. His death, though brief and violent, left a deep impression on the very fabric of Roman governance. His assassination marked the turning point for the empire, a reminder that no ruler, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their own actions. It was an important lesson that future emperors would not easily forget. Even as Rome continued to flourish, expanding its borders and solidifying its place in history, Caligula's madness became a defining point in the story of the empire's evolution. History, it seemed, had a strange way of preserving the names of those who failed. Caligula's story, like many before him, would be retold over and over in the minds of those who sought to understand the fragile nature of power. In the great tapestry of Rome, his name was written not in gold, but in dark ink, smeared by the very hands that had once adored him. It became a symbol of ambition, run wild, of power corrupted by a mind unwilling to stop, a testament to what happens when the soul of an emperor is consumed by his own delusions. As you rest tonight, dear dreamer, remember the tale of Caligula, not just as a story of a madman who ruled an empire, but as a story of what happens when power is allowed to go unchecked. His name echoes through the corridors of time, a whispered warning, a shadow that will never fully fade. For in his rise, his reign, and his fall, there is a lesson to be learned, that power without wisdom will always destroy, not just the ruler, but everything they touch. So sleep well, for even in the darkest chapters of history, there are lessons to be learned, and in the silence of the night, those lessons endure. Though Caligula's reign ended in a bloody coup, the scars he left behind were not so easily erased. The assassination that sealed his fate may have brought relief to many, but for the empire, it marked only the beginning of a long, painful recovery. In the wake of his death, Rome found itself standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down into the depths of its own fragility. The emperor's madness had poisoned the very heart of the empire, and even as the people moved forward, the damage he had wrought remained etched into their collective memory. Claudius, the unlikely ruler who followed Caligula, did his best to restore order, but no matter how hard he tried, he could never fully undo the damage. Caligula had left the imperial administration in chaos. The once proud Senate, which had lost much of its influence under the previous reign, now found itself struggling to regain some measure of respect. While Claudius worked to stabilize the empire, his efforts were often met with skepticism and doubt. The people, still shaken by the horrors they had witnessed under Caligula, could not help but wonder whether the empire was truly safe, or whether the madness that had gripped their last emperor might one day return. And the scars Caligula left on the empire were not only political. The social fabric too had been torn. The people of Rome, once united under a common purpose and faith in their rulers, were now fractured. Their trust in the empire, in the very idea of imperial rule, had been shattered. The extravagant spectacles and games that had once brought them joy now filled them with dread. They had been pawns in a cruel game, their lives twisted into entertainment for an emperor who had seen them only as tools for his own desires. The brutal executions, the torture of those who displeased him. These were not just acts of tyranny, they were symbols of the cruelty that had stained the imperial throne. In the years that followed, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that would shape the course of Roman history for generations to come. Caligula's reign became a reference point, not for greatness, but for excess, for cruelty, for the dangers of absolute power. Every ruler who came after him, whether they embraced the lessons of his reign or sought to distance themselves from his madness, would be compared to him. Caligula's name would forever be synonymous with tyranny, with the kind of leadership that saw not a nation of citizens to serve, but an empire of subjects to be controlled. Historians, scholars, and even the people themselves would continue to question what had driven Caligula to madness. Was he truly ill, as some had suggested, or was his descent into cruelty the inevitable result of unchecked power? Some believed that the emperor's insanity was a result of early trauma, the loss of his father, the poisoning of his family, the political betrayals that surrounded him. Others saw his madness as a deliberate choice, a willful descent into cruelty designed to instill fear and control. No matter the cause, however, the result was the same. Caligula's reign had ended in bloodshed, and his legacy would forever be one of caution, a reminder that no ruler could rule unchecked without consequences. But it was not just Rome that had been affected by Caligula's rule. His influence extended beyond the empire's borders, reaching far into the hearts of nations that had once seen Rome as a beacon of power and stability. To these distant kingdoms, Caligula became not just a symbol of Rome's power, but a symbol of the empire's vulnerability. What had once been an indomitable force had now revealed its weakness, a weakness born from the hubris of one man. Caligula's reign had been a warning, not just to Rome, but to the world. The destruction he had wrought was not confined to his reign, nor was it easily forgotten. Though Caligula had been erased from the throne, his legacy lingered in the stories passed down through generations. His name became a cautionary tale, an example of how the thirst for absolute power could distort even the noblest of minds. In the years to come, it would be invoked not as a name of respect, but as a word of warning. And in the hearts of those who sought power, the memory of Caligula would stand as a grim reminder that even the brightest of emperors could fall into madness, and, in their fall, bring the world crashing down. As centuries passed, the Roman Empire, like all empires, fell into the sands of time, its once grand walls crumbling, its mighty armies disbanding, its emperors becoming nothing more than echoes in the halls of history. Yet, even as Rome itself faded into legend, the shadow of Caligula's reign lingered, his story whispered from generation to generation. His name became a symbol, not only of tyranny and madness, but of the cost of absolute power unchecked by reason or compassion. Across the ages, Caligula's reign was not forgotten. It was recited in lectures, read in the pages of history books, and passed down through the whispered stories of those who sought to warn the future of the dangers of power without empathy. Rulers throughout time, from kings to dictators, from emperors to presidents, all learned from his mistakes. Some feared the same madness might creep into their own hearts, while others believed themselves above such pitfalls, only to fall into similar traps. Caligula's name was invoked whenever power became too concentrated, whenever a ruler became too self-absorbed, too blind to the suffering around them. His reign, once the stuff of myth, had become a real cautionary tale, one that transcended the boundaries of Rome and echoed throughout history. His madness, once thought to be unique to his time, now appeared as an eternal warning to all who would listen, that the line between greatness and cruelty, between wisdom and insanity, was far thinner than anyone could ever imagine. Even as the centuries turned, as empires rose and fell, Caligula's story continued to serve as a chilling reminder. In classrooms where the great names of history were taught, his reign was dissected, not as an example of greatness, but as an example of excess. He was the emperor who reached for the stars, only to fall, consumed by his own arrogance. It was his tale that echoed in the minds of those who would follow in his footsteps, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the fragile line between a ruler's desire to command and the madness that could take root within them. In the world of politics too, Caligula's legacy lived on. His name was often brought up in discussions of leadership, particularly in moments when a ruler was seen to be growing more autocratic, more removed from the needs of their people. The Caligula effect, as it came to be known, was a term used to describe the destructive power of an emperor or leader who loses touch with reality, who seeks not to serve the people, but to dominate them. It was used as both a lesson and a warning, a reminder of what happens when power is wielded with no checks and balances, when a leader surrounds themselves with sycophants and begins to believe their own propaganda. But Caligula's impact was not confined to the realms of politics and history. His story seeped into the cultural psyche, into literature, art, and film. He became a figure of fascination, not just because of the absurdity of his rule, but because of the chilling possibility that anyone could fall into the same trap. In the great works of art that depicted rulers, his image appeared, not as a man of strength, but as a symbol of tragic folly. His actions, his cruelty, his delusions of grandeur, all became part of the lexicon of tyranny and madness. He was a figure that artists returned to, time and time again, as they sought to explore the complexities of power and the human psyche. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Caligula's legacy was the way his story forced future generations to reflect on their own leaders. Every ruler who came after him, whether they were well-meaning or corrupt, had to wrestle with the image of the mad emperor in their minds. The fear of becoming like Caligula, of losing oneself to the intoxicating allure of power, became a shadow that loomed over every throne. His legacy was a moral compass, pointing out the danger of totalitarianism, the cost of unchecked ambition, and the inevitable downfall that awaits those who fail to see the humanity in others. As you close your eyes tonight, let the story of Caligula be a gentle reminder. Power, though often sought, is not without its perils. Those who rule must do so with compassion, with humility, and with an understanding of their own limitations. They must never lose sight of the people they serve, for to do so is to lose everything. Caligula's reign was brief, but his warning is eternal. The lust for power, unchecked by reason, will always consume those who chase it. So rest easy, dear dreamer. The ghosts of the past are there to guide us, to help us navigate the challenges of the present. And as the night wraps you in its quiet embrace, remember that history is not just about the past. It is about the lessons we carry with us, the ones that echo down through the ages, reminding us of the mistakes of those who came before. As the centuries stretched on and the Roman Empire itself dissolved into the annals of time, Caligula's reign transformed from a devastating chapter of history into a quiet, somber reflection. No longer confined to the memories of those who had witnessed his cruelty firsthand, his legacy became something more profound, a symbol that transcended the Roman Empire and continued to shape the very nature of power and leadership. But by this point, the tragedy of his rule had already become a muted echo in the grand expanse of time, its sharp edges softened by the passage of history. For many, Caligula's name evoked more than just fear. It sparked a sense of introspection. It was not just an imperial cautionary tale, but a reflection of the fragility of human nature itself. As the world moved forward, so too did the human experience of power. Leaders who sought to wield absolute authority were reminded of the long shadow cast by Caligula's madness. His story, in its grotesque absurdity, acted as a mirror, showing what happens when the drive for control eclipses all other virtues. This reflection was not limited to kings or emperors alone. Writers, artists, and philosophers looked to Caligula's reign as a microcosm of larger human struggles. What makes someone a leader? What happens when power is abused? What are the dangers of becoming disconnected from the needs of those you lead? These questions swirled around the figure of Caligula, urging anyone who thought themselves above the weight of the world's influence to pause and reconsider. As the tides of history advanced, Caligula's reign would be explored not as just a mere historical event, but as an ongoing dialogue about the dynamics of power and vulnerability. In quiet libraries and bustling universities, his story would be debated with fervor. Was he mad, or merely a man who had let power consume him? Were the horrors of his reign inevitable, or had he been a tragic outlier in the pantheon of leaders who succumbed to their own hubris? Scholars, once fascinated by his tyrannical excesses, would soon realize that his story was not one of solitary madness, but one deeply connected to the nature of rule itself. Through these reflections, the people who studied Caligula's life began to see a chilling common thread. History had shown again and again that those who led without compassion, without wisdom, without the ability to recognize their own limitations were destined to fail. Whether it was Caligula or other infamous figures throughout history, from Napoleon to Stalin, the lesson was clear. The hunger for power, left unchecked, would always breed destruction. It would always end with the loss of something precious, whether it be the empire itself, the people under its rule, or the very soul of the ruler who sought to control it. In the modern world, Caligula's story found itself woven into the fabric of conversations about leadership, authority, and the human condition. His name became a metaphor for unchecked arrogance and the perils of an emperor's isolation from their people. And while many other figures would come and go throughout history, their legacies would be remembered with a mix of admiration and, at times, fear. But Caligula's legacy remained unique in its quiet finality. He was the ruler who had risen to the very pinnacle of power, only to collapse under the weight of his own delusions, leaving behind an empire that would take centuries to rebuild. Yet in the grand silence of time, something else remained. Caligula's story, once filled with blood and madness, transformed into a moral lesson, one that had been passed from one ruler to the next, from one generation to another. His fall, tragic as it was, illuminated the path for those who would come after him. It was as though his story had burned itself into the collective psyche of civilization, an indelible mark that would continue to guide and warn. In a world where the lure of power would never fade, his legacy would remain, not in the grandeur of his rule, but in the cautionary whispers that would forever surround his name. So, as you drift into your peaceful rest, consider the quiet aftermath of Caligula's story. His reign may have ended in violence and madness, but his legacy lived on, a quiet, ever-present reminder that power, no matter how mighty, must always be wielded with humility, compassion, and wisdom. For in the end, those who are consumed by the hunger for control will find that it is their very souls that are lost in the process. The silence of the past can often speak louder than the noise of the present, and in the stillness of the night, when the world slows down and the mind begins to wander, let Caligula's story be a quiet, steady reminder that the path of power is never a straight line. It is full of treacherous turns, hidden dangers, and the ever-present possibility of losing oneself in the pursuit of greatness. 0728E511-12. The story of Caligula, though often told in the fiery language of madness and violence, is, in its quiet aftermath, one of reflection. While history's pages turn and the empire he once ruled crumbles into dust, his legacy continues to echo, not in loud shouts, but in the quiet whispers that follow every ruler, every dictator, every leader who dares to hold power. His name, once a symbol of fear, now stands as a haunting reminder, a subtle warning passed through the ages. It lingers like a shadow that never fully fades, always present, always watching. For generations after his death, it seemed as though his story was forgotten in the vast expanse of time. Yet, when the world was still, when the power of rulers began to grow unchecked once more, Caligula's story returned. It whispered in the corridors of palaces and thrones, a reminder of what can happen when an emperor's will bends reality to its limits. And as long as humanity remains, as long as power is wielded in any form, Caligula's warning will never truly leave us. In the quiet solitude of the night, when the hustle of the world pauses and the bustle of the day fades away, the story of Caligula lives on, not in the grand archives or in the speeches of historians, but in the minds of those who seek wisdom in the darkest corners of history. It is in this silence, in the stillness of reflection, that his legacy finds its most enduring place. It is a legacy not of glory, but of caution, not of greatness, but of humility. The power that Caligula sought, the world he tried to shape with his own hands, is gone, erased by the very madness that fueled it. And yet, his reign continues to serve as a subtle force, one that guides rulers, both ancient and modern, in their decisions. It is no longer the blaring trumpet of tyranny that calls out his name, but the gentle murmur of the past, reminding those who lead that they too are vulnerable to the same pitfalls. And though Caligula may have thought himself above it all, above the gods, above the people, above consequence, history has shown that no one is exempt from the fall. Those who seek to control everything, who believe themselves invincible, are often the ones most prone to collapse. His rule was brief, but the lessons it taught endure. It is not in the monuments he built, nor in the grandeur of his power, but in the silence after his reign that we find the truth of his story. The final chapter of Caligula's life, like the final moments of any ruler, was not one of grand declarations, but of quiet reflection on the fleeting nature of power and the price one pays for it. In his death there was no martyrdom, no heroic struggle. There was only the realization that all he had sought to control was, in the end, beyond his grasp. In the end, it was not his people who betrayed him, but his own insatiable hunger for more power, more control, that led him to ruin. And so, as you lie here tonight, letting the calm of sleep wash over you, think of Caligula not as a madman, but as a reflection of the dangers of unchecked desire. Power, when wielded without wisdom, always leads to its own undoing. It is in the stillness, in the quiet moments of contemplation, that we truly see the lessons of history. Caligula's reign was not just a failure of leadership, but a warning for all who would follow in his footsteps. His story, long gone from the forefront of history, still serves as a quiet sentinel, watching from the shadows. Every time a leader rises with unshakable conviction, with a belief that they are above all, Caligula's whisper grows a little louder, urging them to remember the cost of absolute power. In the end, as you drift off into your peaceful rest, remember this: the legacy of Caligula is not one of grandeur, but of caution. It lives on in the spaces between breaths, in the lessons we carry with us, silent yet ever present. It is in the quiet moments, as we close our eyes, that we hear it most clearly. The echo of a ruler who sought everything and lost it all. As the years bled into decades and centuries, the bustling heart of the Roman Empire eventually slowed, its once unyielding pulse weakening with time. The walls of the eternal city, which had once reverberated with the sounds of power, military victories, and imperial decrees, now stood silent, their grandeur slowly eroding. Rome, as it once was no more, and the empire that had stretched across continents crumbled into smaller fragments, scattered across the pages of history. Yet, in the quiet of this decay, one story remained, whispered through the corridors of time, carried through the wind of every empire that rose and fell after it. That story was Caligula's. In the quiet aftermath of Rome's political disintegration, Caligula's name found its way not only into the halls of academia, but also into the hearts of those who sought to understand the delicate balance between power and the human spirit. His reign, which had seemed like an aberration in the moment, became something more, an enduring symbol, not of an emperor lost to madness, but of the fragility of human ambition. To many, Caligula's story seemed almost mythical. He was not just a man who ruled an empire, he was the embodiment of the dangers of unchecked power, an icon of what could happen when a leader loses touch with their people and themselves. His name became synonymous with excess, cruelty, and the pursuit of power at any cost. It was in the wake of his madness that future rulers, those who looked back at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, found the very real lessons about governance that had eluded him in his time. Yet, as time wore on, Caligula's reign, once so vivid in its violence and extravagance, faded into a quiet reflection in the broader narrative of Roman history. He was no longer the terrifying figure that had haunted the empire during his lifetime, but a distant memory, framed by those who lived after him as a reminder of what could befall even the greatest of rulers. The world had moved on from the chaotic and bloody days of his reign, but the impact he left, though quiet now, remained indelible. The silence of history, after all, speaks loudly to those who listen. In this modern era, with its global reach and complex governments, Caligula's name is still invoked during conversations about the dangers of authoritarian rule, unchecked power, and the psychological toll of absolute authority. It's no longer the loud cries of despair from the streets of Rome that echo through the corridors, but the quiet, lingering warning of a man who thought himself a god and learned too late that all empires are fragile, no matter how mighty they appear. Yet, there is something almost tragic in how Caligula's story has come to be perceived, a complex mixture of terror and pity. He was not born a madman. He was once a young man, full of promise, full of the hopes that come with being the heir to an empire. His early years were marked by loss, trauma, and betrayal, elements that undoubtedly shaped the course of his reign. The tragedy of Caligula was not just that he lost control of an empire, it was that he lost control of himself. His was a story of destruction, yes, but also of deep loneliness, of a man who sought power so desperately that he ignored the simple truths of the human condition. The very thing that made him a ruler, his ability to impose his will upon those around him, was the thing that ultimately destroyed him. It wasn't the size of the empire or the splendor of his court that led to his downfall. It was the arrogance of believing that he was beyond consequence, beyond the fragility of the mortal world. As the night falls and the quiet settles in, think of Caligula not just as a symbol of tyranny, but as a person, a ruler who was overwhelmed by the weight of his own ambition. He was once like many of us, a person with dreams, desires, and a future that could have been shaped by wisdom and compassion. Yet, he became something else. His story teaches us not only the dangers of unchecked power, but also the dangers of losing our humanity in the pursuit of greatness. Caligula's reign may have been brief, but the silence that followed his death speaks volumes. For in the space between the loud events of his reign and the quiet of history, there lies a deeper truth. Power can corrupt, yes, but it is also the loss of connection, the abandonment of empathy, the failure to see oneself as a part of something greater than one's own desires, that leads even the greatest to fall. And so, as you prepare to drift into the peaceful embrace of sleep, remember the lessons that Caligula's legacy imparts. Power, unchecked and unbalanced, consumes not only those who wield it, but the very empire they seek to control. In this quiet moment of reflection, may you find solace in the knowledge that the true strength of any ruler or any person lies not in domination, but in the wisdom to see beyond themselves, to lead with compassion and humility. For even in the shadows of history, the whispers of the past remind us, all that rises must one day fall, and the truest measure of power is how it is used, not how it is seen. As the empire moved on from the shadow of Caligula's reign, the city of Rome itself, once scarred by the horrors of his madness, began to find its own healing rhythm. The wounds were deep, but the Roman spirit, resilient as ever, did not simply fade into oblivion. There was a quiet restoration, an unseen, slow process that took root in the hearts of the people and the corridors of power. With Caligula's violent end and the uncertain rise of his successor, Claudius, Rome began to rebuild not only its structures, but its soul. Though Claudius was not a ruler who would be remembered with the same grandeur as some of his predecessors, he was the right man for the moment. The empire needed stability more than it needed splendor, and Claudius provided that. He may have been underestimated by many at first, thought of as weak and easily controlled, but beneath his seemingly awkward demeanor lay a ruler who could heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon Rome during the madness of Caligula's reign. Claudius brought Rome a new sense of peace, a breath of fresh air after the suffocating grip of terror that had defined the previous years. While his reign was not without its challenges, the people of Rome slowly regained their trust in the empire. Claudius's rule was marked by efforts to restore the Senate's influence, and although he was not an emperor who sought to undermine the people's traditional beliefs and values, he knew that the empire needed to heal in every sense. As the dust settled from the chaos of Caligula's time, Rome began to look toward its future with a cautious optimism, though the memories of the emperor's cruelty would never truly fade. For those who lived through Caligula's reign, the restoration was as much a psychological process as it was political. The fear that had once gripped the streets, the terror of random executions and absurd imperial demands, began to dissipate, but the damage was not easily undone. The people of Rome were wary, their trust in leadership forever shaken. They had learned a painful truth, that power could be seized by a single individual, that the empire's stability was precarious, and that anyone, no matter how lofty their position, could be consumed by madness. In time, though, the Republic's heartbeat returned to its natural rhythm. As much as the scars of Caligula's rule were indelible, Rome was ever a city of rebirth, of reinvention. New emperors would rise, bringing their own strengths and weaknesses, their own triumphs and failures. But none would be quite like Caligula. His era was over, and with it, a new chapter began for the people of Rome. This chapter, though shaped by his lessons, was one of steady leadership, of careful governance, of rulers who would try, though not always succeed, to lead with wisdom rather than with iron fists. Caligula, though long gone, left behind a city that was different in ways both subtle and profound. The ruins of his reign, once a symbol of unchecked terror, now stood as silent markers of what had been lost. They were not celebrated, not monuments to the man who had once held the reins of the empire, but reminders of the dangers of a ruler who let his own delusions control him. The great palace he had built, his lavish theatres, his gardens and temples, were now nothing more than memories. Some of them remained, decaying with the years, as if Rome itself was whispering to the future, "Never forget what happens when power is allowed to rot from within." The restoration of Rome was also a restoration of hope. It was a slow, quiet rebuilding of the trust that had been so cruelly broken. The people learned not just from the emperors who followed Caligula, but from their own collective memory. The lessons of his madness were not forgotten, even as the empire regained its strength. His name would never be spoken with reverence, but it would never be erased. It lingered in the whispers of those who had witnessed his cruelty, and in the minds of those who had learned the hard way about the dangers of unchecked power. For every future ruler of Rome, the story of Caligula would serve as a soft, persistent reminder, woven into the very fabric of Roman governance. It wasn't just about the grand speeches or the public triumphs. It was about the quiet, steady strength required to lead with honor and empathy. And as the empire moved forward, Caligula's ghost did not haunt them as a spectre of terror, but as a teacher, his lessons not just etched in the stone of history, but carried in the hearts of those who had seen the destruction he had caused. As the final days of the Roman Empire stretched into the far-reaching horizon of time, the once mighty city that had seen the rise and fall of countless emperors, warriors, and dynasties found a strange sense of stillness. The violent storms of history, which had battered its foundations, began to quiet. The ghosts of the past, including the shadow of Caligula, no longer roamed the streets in the same way. His name, once whispered in terror and awe, became nothing more than a fleeting thought in the minds of those who remembered the horrors of his reign. Yet, even in this peaceful silence, Caligula's legacy remained. In the serene distance of history, where the clamor of Rome's imperial past had softened into memory, his story had transformed. No longer was Caligula merely the mad tyrant who ruled with a cruel, deluded fist. His narrative had woven itself into the tapestry of Rome, where his excesses and madness served as a silent guide for future generations. It was a guide not for how to rule, but for how not to lead. And as the centuries passed, this lesson became more profound. more ingrained in the collective conscience of humankind. Rome itself, though no longer the dominant power it once was, had long learned to honor the past without repeating its mistakes. Caligula's reign, a brief, chaotic storm in the grand history of Rome, became an integral part of this delicate balance. The story of his rise and fall was no longer a tale of terror, but a quiet, reflective piece of history that taught the importance of restraint, wisdom, and the recognition of one's limits. It was a story told not with anger or bitterness, but with understanding. Understanding that power, when misused, could bring even the greatest empire to its knees. As time went on, those who learned of Caligula's madness were able to reflect on what it meant for them, in their own lives, in their own nations. The rulers and leaders of generations past, and those still to come, began to understand the cost of unchecked ambition. There was a quiet, collective peace that settled over the world as people acknowledged that the mistakes of history need not be repeated. For those who understood Caligula's fall, his reign was a warning that could never truly fade, but could instead guide toward a more balanced future. Caligula himself, once so consumed by his own delusions, had long since been reduced to a cautionary figure in the annals of history. His name no longer struck fear into the hearts of the people, but it remained as if suspended in time, waiting to be remembered, not with dread, but with solemnity. His story had become part of a greater narrative, one that spanned the ages, reminding humanity that power, if not tempered by wisdom and humility, would always lead to ruin. And so, as the years stretched into decades, and the centuries unfurled before the world, the legacy of Caligula continued to linger, quietly echoing in the background of every empire, every ruler, every leader who sought power. It was the final peace, the peace that came from learning the lessons of the past and finding the wisdom to let go of the destructive hunger for dominance. His reign had been one of madness and destruction, but in the final analysis, it had provided humanity with something more valuable than all the riches of Rome. It had given the world a lesson in the limits of power, the importance of empathy, and the necessity of balance in leadership. As you lie down to sleep tonight, let the peaceful quiet of the world around you serve as a reminder. Caligula's reign may have been long past, but the lessons he left behind, the echo of his madness, will forever resonate in the choices we make today. His rise, his fall, and the space between them form the bedrock of wisdom for those who follow. And as the world moves ever forward, remember that true strength lies not in the hunger for more, but in the quiet understanding of how little we really need. And with this understanding, sleep peacefully, knowing that the lessons of the past have shaped the future, and that each new day is an opportunity to wield power wisely, with humility, with empathy, and with grace.